homeless boy stormed onto a plane shouting, "Don't take off, it will crash!" The passengers mocked him, but when the technicians returned after the inspection, everyone fell silent. Jamal shuffled along the edge of the terminal, eyes darting left and right as he scanned the garbage bins for something to eat. His stomach growled, a constant reminder of his hunger. The early morning crowd bustled past him, people busy with luggage and families, too focused on their flights to notice the boy in tattered clothes lingering by the trash. He spotted a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic. He leaned over the bin and grabbed it quickly, hoping no one would see. Jamal bit into it without thinking, chewing fast. It was stale, but his stomach didn't care. "Hey, kid, what are you doing there?" a voice shouted. Jamal jerked his head up, seeing a uniformed airport security guard striding towards him. The guy was broad-shouldered, his face set in a scowl. Jamal didn't think twice. He turned and bolted. He knew this routine well. The guard was one of many who had chased him before. Jamal's feet pounded on the cold floor, weaving through crowds. He could hear the guard's heavy footsteps behind him and the man's loud grunts as he tried to catch up. He dashed past a family standing in line, nearly knocking over a rolling suitcase, then slipped around a corner. He knew the layout of the airport by heart now. He had been here for months. He zigzagged through a small hallway, ducking behind a pillar, and waited, holding his breath. The footsteps faded away. He could hear the guard cursing as he gave up. Jamal let out a sigh, slumping against the pillar. His heart thudded in his ears. He took another bite of the sandwich, trying to calm down. He peered around the corner. The guard was gone. Safe for now. Jamal wandered further into the airport, keeping to the quieter sections. He liked the observation deck, where he could watch the planes take off. He made his way there, sticking close to the walls. People hardly paid attention to him. To them, he was invisible. A skinny kid with dirt on his face and a backpack that looked like it might fall apart any minute. He reached the observation area and settled down on a bench, pulling his knees up to his chest. Out the window, planes were lining up on the runway, one after another, their engines roaring. He liked watching them. It made him think about getting away from this place. Somewhere warm, somewhere he wouldn't have to hide all the time. He clenched his jaw. Jamal couldn't remember the last time he felt truly warm or safe. Not since his parents died 8 months ago. Not since the accident. The thought of it made his chest tighten, and he tried to push it away, focusing instead on the planes. The doors to the observation area opened, and Jamal glanced over, his muscles tensing. It was just a couple of tourists, laughing and pointing at the runway. He relaxed again, though his eyes stayed alert. Hours passed like this, watching planes, moving from one hidden spot to another, and trying to stay out of sight. He found an old cardboard box to sit on, tucked into a corner behind some unused equipment, and pulled his backpack onto his lap. It contained all his belongings, a blanket full of holes, a photo of his parents, and a few crumpled-up dollar bills he managed to get from begging at the terminal entrance. As night approached, the cold set in. Jamal curled into himself, his teeth chattering. He pulled the blanket over his shoulders, trying to keep the cold away, but it was useless. Atlanta's airport was warm inside, but there were drafts everywhere. Corners where the wind seemed to slip through, even in a building as massive as this. He rested his head back, his eyelids heavy. Sleep wasn't easy. Every noise made him jump, the rattle of a luggage cart, the murmur of voices, the clinking of shoes on the tiled floor. It was always like this, the fear of someone finding him, pulling him away to some shelter where he'd just run from again. Suddenly, he heard something, an odd, low, humming noise. Jamal opened his eyes and looked around. He leaned forward, peeking out from his hiding spot. Down on the tarmac, he could see one of the airplanes parked by the gate. Underneath it, there was a dark stain slowly growing, some kind of fluid dripping from one of the engines. Jamal frowned. That didn't look right. He knew a little bit about machines. His dad used to work as a mechanic, and sometimes Jamal would hang out in the garage watching him fix cars. He knew enough to recognize when something was off. He pushed himself to his feet, the cold and hunger momentarily forgotten. Jamal edged closer to the glass, staring at the plane. The dripping continued. He watched as a few airport workers walked by, but none of them seemed to notice. The boarding had already started. People were lining up, excited to get on board. Jamal swallowed, his heart beginning to race. He didn't know exactly what was wrong, but he had a gut feeling that it was bad. Really bad. He looked around the observation deck. No one seemed to care. They were all too busy on their phones or talking. He had to do something. Jamal grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. He moved fast, darting down the stairs, making his way to the terminal gate. He wasn't sure how he was going to do this, but he couldn't just stand by. People were getting on that plane. It was going to take off soon. As he got closer, he could hear the announcements. Flight 285, now boarding. The line of passengers was thinning as people made their way through the gate, heading down to the jet bridge. Jamal hesitated, his palms sweating. He could see security guards patrolling nearby, and the memory of being chased earlier flashed through his mind. But he pushed it aside. He had to warn them. He took a deep breath, then sprinted forward, ducking under the ropes that separated the boarding area from the rest of the terminal. "Hey, stop!" someone yelled. Jamal ignored them, running towards the gate. He could see the flight attendants, could see the door to the plane still open. He skidded to a stop, his breath coming in gasps. "Don't let it take off!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Something's wrong with the engine. It's leaking!" Everyone turned to look at him. Passengers, attendants, even the security guards. For a moment, there was silence. Then, chaos. One of the flight attendants rushed towards him, while another grabbed the phone on the wall. The passengers looked confused, some of them scared. Jamal tried to catch his breath, pointing towards the plane. "Please," he said, his voice quieter now. "Just check it. It's leaking something. It's not safe." Before he could say anything else, a pair of strong arms grabbed him from behind. He struggled, twisting, but the guard held him firm. "You're in big trouble, kid," the guard growled. "No, you have to listen. It's the plane," Jamal shouted, his eyes wide with panic. The flight attendant looked at him, her face uncertain. She glanced back at the plane, then at the other attendants. Finally, she nodded and spoke into her radio. "Tell them to hold the takeoff," she said. "We need an inspection." Jamal stopped struggling, his chest heaving. He looked up at the guard, his eyes pleading. "Please," he whispered, "just check it." The guard didn't say anything, just tightened his grip. Jamal let himself go limp, his eyes closing for a moment. He had done what he could. Now, all he could do was wait. Jamal's heart pounded as he was dragged away by the security guard. His arms ached from the tight grip, but his eyes stayed fixed on the airplane through the terminal window. He could see the flight attendants talking, pointing at the plane, and then a group of technicians heading toward the engine. He was too far away to hear anything, but he hoped they'd listen to him. "Come on, kid. You've really done it now," the guard grumbled, yanking Jamal along the hallway away from the gate. They turned a corner, where two more guards waited, frowning at the commotion. "What's the deal?" one of them asked. "Caught this kid trying to board the plane. Says something's wrong with it," the guard scoffed, like he couldn't believe it himself. Jamal struggled to stand still, his legs shaking. He looked at the other guards, trying to find someone, anyone, who would listen. "There was a leak," Jamal said, his voice cracking. "It was dripping from the engine. I saw it. Please just listen. You have to make sure they don't take off." The second guard eyed Jamal, his face softer. He glanced over his shoulder toward the gate. The terminal was still in chaos. Passengers were clustered around, confused and scared. One of the flight attendants was on the phone, her eyes darting nervously between Jamal and the plane. "Should we check it out?" the second guard said, nudging the one holding Jamal. "Maybe the kid's got a point." "Nah, he's just making trouble," the first guard grunted. "Probably looking for a place to sleep or something. Come on, let's get him out of here." Jamal's eyes widened in panic. He couldn't let them just ignore it. He twisted in the guard's grip, shouting as loud as he could. "It's not safe. You have to stop them, please." The noise caught the attention of one of the technicians who had been walking towards the plane. He paused, looked up, and then seemed to think better of ignoring the commotion. He turned back, heading towards the guards, his orange vest bright against the dim terminal light. "What's going on?" the technician asked, his brow furrowed. "This kid thinks there's an issue with the plane," the second guard said, his voice cautious. The technician looked at Jamal, studying him for a moment. Jamal could see the doubt in his eyes, but also a flicker of something else, maybe curiosity. "It's leaking something. I saw it," Jamal said, breathing hard. He swallowed, trying to steady his voice. "Under the left engine, a dark liquid. It didn't look right." The technician hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll take a look." He turned back towards the plane, signaling to his co-workers. Jamal let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping. "See," Jamal said, his voice almost a whisper. "Just check. That's all I wanted." The guard holding him sighed, his grip loosening. "You're still in trouble, kid," he muttered, but he wasn't pulling Jamal away anymore. Minutes felt like hours as Jamal stood there, held by the guard, watching the technicians. They moved slowly, checking the underside of the plane. Jamal could see one of them climb a ladder, peering at the engine with a flashlight. He tried to read their faces, to see if they found anything wrong, but they were too far away. Then one of the technicians waved his arm, and a second came running over. They spoke in hushed voices. Then one of them turned and ran towards the terminal, his expression tense. Jamal's stomach twisted. Maybe he was right. Maybe they were taking it seriously. He could see some of the passengers now, getting off the plane, escorted by the flight attendants. A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion turning to fear. One of the technicians approached the guard holding Jamal. "We found a hydraulic fluid leak," he said, shaking his head. "Good thing we caught it. Could have been a disaster if they took off like that." The guard stared at the technician, then at Jamal. For a second, there was just silence. Then the guard let go of Jamal's arm, the tension in his shoulders relaxing. "Kid, you're lucky," he said, his voice softer now. "You might have just saved all those people." Jamal didn't feel lucky. His arms were sore, his legs shaky.
Sarah, one of the other instructors, must have noticed something was wrong because she asked if I was okay. I made up some excuse about feeling sick and practically ran out of there. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept seeing that smile every time I closed my eyes. The next day I almost called in sick, but I needed the job and convinced myself it had just been my imagination. That's when things got even weirder. During my morning class, while my students were at the bar, I started hearing things. Light footsteps behind me when no one was there. Doors would close by themselves, not slam, just close quietly like someone was trying not to disturb class. Sometimes the piano in the corner would make these soft plinking sounds, just one or two notes, even though no one was near it. About a week after my first encounter, I finally broke down and talked to Marion, the cleaning lady who'd been there for decades. I figured if anyone knew anything strange about the building, it would be her. What she told me made everything so much worse. Turns out the building used to be part of the old Cedar Falls Hospital back in the 1920s. This particular floor had been the maternity ward. Marion said she'd heard stories from other staff members about seeing a blonde woman in white, but most people just dismissed them as urban legends. But here's the detail that still haunts me. According to Marion, in 1925, there was a young nurse who worked in the maternity ward. She had blonde, curly hair, and was known for her perpetual smile, which some found comforting and others found unsettling. The story goes that she became obsessed with one of the babies in her care and tried to take it. When she was caught, she jumped from one of the windows. The hospital closed that wing for months afterward. Over the next few months, the encounters continued. Sometimes it was just that cold feeling and the footsteps. Other times I'd see her in the mirror, always smiling, always watching.
"You're in big trouble, kid," the guard growled. "No, you have to listen. It's the plane," Jamal shouted, his eyes wide with panic. The flight attendant looked at him, her face uncertain. She glanced back at the plane, then at the other attendants. Finally, she nodded and spoke into her radio. "Tell them to hold the takeoff," she said. "We need an inspection." Jamal stopped struggling, his chest heaving. He looked up at the guard, his eyes.
She never appeared when there were more than 1 or 2 people in the room, and never during busy classes. It was like she was waiting for moments when she could catch someone alone. The last time I saw her was in December of that year. I was closing up after my last class of the day. Everyone else had left, and I was doing a final check of the studios before heading home. In Studio 3, the smallest practice room, I felt that familiar cold sensation. When I turned to leave, she was there, not in the mirror this time, but standing directly in front of the door. Her smile was different that time, sadder somehow. She raised her hand like she wanted to reach out to me, and for the first time, I heard her voice. It wasn't scary or threatening like you might expect. It was barely a whisper, and all she said was, "Stay." I don't remember running past her or going down the stairs. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, shaking and crying. I quit the next day, found a position at a different studio across town. I still dance and teach, but I've never gone back to that building. Sometimes I drive past it late at night, and I swear I can see someone standing in those second-floor windows just watching. Always watching. The thing that bothers me most isn't the fear I felt, or even the possibility that ghosts might be real. It's that I never understood why she chose to appear to me. Was it because I was alone? Because I was a dancer? Or was there something else, some connection I never figured out? The building is still there, still a dance studio. New students and teachers come and go. Sometimes I hear rumors about strange things happening there. Cold spots, mysterious footsteps, doors closing on their own. But as far as I know, no one has ever seen her quite like I did. Maybe she's still there, waiting for the right person to notice her. Or maybe she's finally found whatever she was looking for. I don't know if anyone will believe this story.
The guard grunted, probably looking for a place to sleep or something. "Come on, let's get him out of here." Jamal's eyes widened in panic. He couldn't let them just ignore it. He twisted in the guard's grip, shouting as loud as he could. "It's not safe. You have to stop them, please." The noise caught the attention of one of the technicians who had been walking towards the plane. He paused, looked up, and then seemed to think.
Most days I'm not even sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in a studio with mirrors, I still catch myself checking the reflections behind me, just in case that smile is waiting there again. Story 3. I never thought I'd share this story, but after 12 years I still can't make sense of what happened to my family that summer in Franklin. I need to get this off my chest, even though my hands are shaking just typing this out. We moved to Tennessee in May 2012. Me, my husband Mike, and our 2 kids, Emily, 11, and Sarah, 6. The house was everything we'd dreamed of. A beautiful Victorian mansion with wraparound porches, intricate woodwork, and enough space for the kids to each have their own rooms. The real estate price was surprisingly reasonable, which should have been our first red flag. The strange thing started about 2 weeks after we moved in. At first it was small stuff that you could easily explain away. A book that wasn't where you left it, keys appearing on a different counter, the usual stuff that happens when you're still getting used to a new house. But then it escalated. I remember the first incident that really scared me. I was alone in the house, unpacking boxes in the dining room while the kids were at school and Mike was at work. I had just finished arranging our china cabinet when I heard distinct footsteps upstairs, heavy boots walking across the floor above me. My blood ran cold because I knew I was alone. I called out hello, but got no response. When I gathered the courage to go upstairs, every room was empty, but the master bedroom was ice cold. Not just cool, I mean freezing, like standing in a walk-in freezer. The rest of the house was perfectly normal, humid Tennessee summer temperature. The lights were the next thing.
His expression tense. Jamal's stomach twisted. Maybe he was right. Maybe they were taking it seriously. He could see some of the passengers now, getting off the plane, escorted by the flight attendants. A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion turning to fear. One of the technicians approached the guard holding Jamal. "We found a hydraulic fluid leak," he said, shaking his head. "Good thing we caught it. Could have been a disaster if they took off like that."
They would flicker constantly, but not like normal electrical issues. They'd flash in patterns, almost like Morse code. We had 3 different electricians come out, and they all said the wiring was perfectly fine, though one mentioned it was unusually old for a house that had supposedly been renovated in the 90s. But the thing that still haunts me was what started happening with Sarah. She began talking about her new friend Thomas about a month after we moved in. At first, we thought it was cute. New house, new imaginary friend, totally normal for a 6-year-old. But the things she would tell us about Thomas were disturbing. "Thomas has a hole in his leg," she told me one morning at breakfast, completely casual while eating her cereal. "That's why he limps. He got shot when they brought all the hurt men here." I asked her what she meant, and she explained, in detail that no 6-year-old should know, about how they used to fix the soldiers here, and how sometimes they had to cut their arms and legs off in the big room downstairs. She said Thomas told her all about it. That night I started researching the history of our house. What I found made my stomach turn. Our home had indeed served as a makeshift Confederate hospital during the Civil War. Hundreds of soldiers were treated there, and many died there. One account mentioned a young doctor named Thomas Harrison who was shot in the leg while trying to help wounded soldiers reach the house. He survived but walked with a limp for the rest of his life. The activity peaked one night in July. I was doing laundry in the basement, which always gave me the creeps, when I heard Sarah giggling upstairs. It was nearly midnight, and she should have been asleep. I went up to check on her, and as I climbed the stairs, I heard her talking. "No, Thomas, I can't go with you. Mommy says I'm not supposed to leave the house at night." It was a young nurse who worked in the maternity ward. She had blonde, curly hair and was known for her perpetual smile, which some found comforting and others found unsettling. The story goes that she became obsessed with one of the babies in her care and tried to take it. When she was caught, she jumped from one of the windows. The hospital closed that wing for months afterward. Over the next few months, the encounters continued. Sometimes it was just that cold feeling and the footsteps. Other times I'd see her in the mirror, always smiling, always watching.
"You're in big trouble, kid," the guard growled. "No, you have to listen. It's the plane."
I ran to her room and found her standing by the window, which was wide open, on the 2nd floor. She turned to me with the most innocent smile and said, "Thomas wants to show me where they buried the soldiers, Mommy." I grabbed her away from the window, and that's when I felt it. That same freezing cold air from before. The temperature dropped so fast I could see our breath. The light in her room began to flicker wildly, and then we heard it, the sound of boots, dozens of them, marching up and down the hallway outside her room. Sarah started crying, and I held her tight as we heard what sounded like men moaning in pain. The sounds got louder and louder until it felt like we were in the middle of a hospital ward. I could smell something metallic, like blood, and antiseptic. Sarah screamed, "Thomas, you're scaring me." And suddenly everything stopped. The temperature returned to normal, the lights stabilized, and the sounds vanished. We ran to Emily's room and found her huddled under her blankets, shaking. "Did you hear them too?" she whispered. "The soldiers?" We spent the rest of the night in the master bedroom with all the lights on. Mike had been away on a business trip, and when he got back the next day, we told him everything. He'd been skeptical about all the previous incidents, but seeing how terrified we all were, finally convinced him something was seriously wrong. We called a local historian to learn more about the house. She confirmed everything: the hospital, the soldiers, Dr. Thomas Harrison. She even showed us old photographs. In one of them, taken in 1863, a group of medical staff stood on our front porch. My hands started shaking when I saw him, a young doctor with a cane, his name listed as T. Harrison in the caption. Sarah happened to walk by and pointed at him immediately. "That's Thomas." The historian's face went pale. She told us she had interviewed dozens of families who had lived in the house over the years. The building is still there, still a dance studio. New students and teachers come and go. Sometimes I hear rumors about strange things happening there. Cold spots, mysterious footsteps, doors closing on their own. But as far as I know, no one has ever seen her quite like I did. Maybe she's still there, waiting for the right person to notice her. Or maybe she's finally found whatever she was looking for. Many had reported similar experiences, especially with children talking about Thomas. Several families had moved out abruptly. We put the house up for sale the next day. It took us 3 months to find a buyer, and those were the longest 3 months of my life. The activity never stopped. Doors would slam on their own, objects would move or disappear completely, and sometimes we'd wake up to find Civil War-era medical tools laid out on the dining room table, even though we'd locked all the doors and windows. The worst part? After we moved out, Sarah kept talking about Thomas for months. She said he was sad we left, but understood why. She said he just wanted to make sure people remembered what happened there, remembered all the brave men who died in that house. I still drive by that house sometimes when I'm in Franklin. New families have moved in and out over the years. Sometimes I think about warning them, but who would believe such a crazy story? All I know is that every time I pass by, I swear I can see someone standing in the upstairs window, a figure with a cane, watching over the property, still making his rounds after all these years. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what we experienced in that house was real. Some places have too much history, too much pain embedded in their walls. That house in Franklin taught me that sometimes the past doesn't want to stay buried. Story 4. I never believed in the paranormal before moving to Prescott Valley. My wife Sarah and I were so excited when we found this affordable apartment complex last summer. It seemed like the perfect starter home for us. The rent was surprisingly reasonable for such a nice area, and we thought we'd hit the jackpot. Now, 8 months later, I'm typing this with shaking hands because I need to get this off my chest. I had just finished arranging our china cabinet when I heard distinct footsteps upstairs, heavy boots walking across the floor above me. My blood ran cold because I knew I was alone. I called out hello, but got no response. When I gathered the courage to go upstairs, every room was empty, but the master bedroom was ice cold. Not just cool, I mean freezing, like standing in a walk-in freezer. The rest of the house was perfectly normal, humid Tennessee summer temperature. The lights were the next thing.
His expression tense. Jamal's stomach twisted. Maybe he was right. Maybe they were taking it seriously.
I need to tell someone what happened to us last night. Looking back, the weird stuff started about 2 weeks after we moved in. At first, it was just little things that were easy to rationalize away. You know how you put your keys down somewhere and then can't find them? Well, this was different. Our stuff would vanish and then show up in places we never would have put them. Like my work laptop appearing in the kitchen cabinet, or Sarah's jewelry box somehow ending up in the bathroom sink. I remember the first time something really unexplainable happened. I was working late from home, around 11 p.m., while Sarah was already asleep. Our TV suddenly turned on by itself, full volume, static noise blasting through the apartment. I nearly jumped out of my skin. When I went to turn it off, the remote wouldn't work. I had to unplug it from the wall. I told myself it was just some weird electrical issue, but deep down, something felt wrong. Then the voices started. At first, we thought it was just thin walls and noisy neighbors. We'd hear what sounded like conversations, multiple people talking in low murmurs. But whenever we'd try to make out the words, they'd stop. The crazy part, we later found out that the apartment next door had been vacant for months. Sarah started getting really freaked out about 2 months ago. She said she kept seeing movement in her peripheral vision, like someone walking past doorways or standing in corners. I didn't want to admit it, but I was seeing it too. A dark figure, always just at the edge of your vision. When you'd turn to look directly at it, it would be gone, but you could feel it watching you. Last night, everything came to a head. I wish I could explain it away, but I can't. We were getting ready for bed around 10:30 p.m. Sarah was in the bathroom washing her face, and I was setting my alarm for work. That's when the temperature dropped dramatically, like walking into a freezer. Our breath was literally visible in the air. Going upstairs. It was nearly midnight, and she should have been asleep. I went up to check on her, and as I climbed the stairs, I heard her talking. "No, Thomas, I can't go with you. Mommy says I'm not supposed to leave the house at night." It was a young nurse who worked in the maternity ward. She had blonde, curly hair and was known for her perpetual smile, which some found comforting and others. Then all our electronics went haywire simultaneously. The TV turned on and off rapidly. Our phones started ringing with no-caller ID calls. The microwave began beeping, and even our smart lights were flickering like crazy. The noise was deafening. Sarah ran out of the bathroom, and we both stood there paralyzed with fear. That's when we saw it, not in our peripheral vision this time, but straight on. A tall, dark figure standing at the end of our hallway. It was like a void in the shape of a person. The longer we stared, the more wrong it felt. It didn't move like a person should. It seemed to shift and distort, like smoke but denser. The air around it looked warped, almost like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it left bruises. We couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure started moving toward us, but not by walking. It was like it was gliding, getting closer in jerky, unnatural movements. The temperature kept dropping, and this overwhelming feeling of dread washed over us. You know that primal fear response people talk about? That fight or flight instinct? This was beyond that. This was pure paralyzing terror. Just before it reached us, everything electronic in our apartment died simultaneously. Complete darkness and silence. When I finally managed to turn on my phone's flashlight, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. We spent the rest of the night in our car at a Walmart parking lot. This morning, I started Googling the history of this area, trying to make sense of what happened. That's when I found out something that made my blood run cold. This whole apartment complex, it was built on what used to be an ancient Native American burial ground. The construction was controversial back in 2010, but the developers pushed it through anyway. We're staying at a hotel right now. All our stuff is still in that apartment, but honestly, they can keep it. Dr. Thomas Harrison. She even showed us old photographs. In one of them, taken in 1863, a group of medical staff stood on our front porch. My hands started shaking when I saw him, a young doctor with a cane, his name listed as T. Harrison in the caption. Sarah happened to walk by and pointed at him immediately. That's Thomas. The historian's face went pale. She told us she had interviewed dozens of families who had lived in the house over. We're breaking our lease. I don't care about the deposit or the fees. Nothing is worth going through another night like that. The thing that really gets to me, the figure we saw, it matches descriptions from 3 other former residents who moved out suddenly. I found their stories buried in old local news comment sections and community forums. They all described the same things: objects moving, voices, electronics acting up, and that dark, distorted figure. I keep telling myself there must be some logical explanation. Gas leak, mass hysteria, something. But I know what we saw. I know what we felt. That oppressive ancient feeling of something that didn't want us there. Something that was there long before us and will be there long after. I'm writing this from our hotel room. Sarah's finally managed to fall asleep, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure. And even though we're miles away from that apartment now, I still can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. Like whatever was in that apartment, some part of it followed us. If you're house hunting in Prescott Valley and come across an unusually good deal on an apartment, especially in the newer complexes on the east side, do yourself a favor. Look up the history of the land first. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Some things should be left at rest. Update. A lot of people have been asking for the exact location. I won't give it because I don't want to cause problems for the property management company. But I will say this. In the 2 days since we left, 3 people have reached out to me privately saying they experienced similar things in the same complex. One of them shared a video of their TV turning on and off by itself, exactly like what happened to us. I'm not saying this proves anything, but it helps knowing we're not crazy. I've also had several Native American folks from the area message me about the history of this land. Stay buried. Story 4. I never believed in the paranormal before moving to Prescott Valley. My wife Sarah and I were so excited when we found this affordable apartment complex last summer. It seemed like the perfect starter home for us. The rent was surprisingly reasonable for such a nice area, and we thought we'd hit the jackpot. Now, 8 months later, I'm typing this with shaking hands because I need to get this off my chest. I had just finished arranging our china cabinet when I heard distinct footsteps upstairs. Heavy boot.
He couldn't remember the last time he'd been able to choose what he wanted to eat. He looked up at Mr. Carlson, who was watching him with a smile, and for the first time, Jamal allowed himself to feel something like hope. He ordered a burger, fries, and a milkshake, his stomach growling at the thought. Mr. Carlson ordered the same, and they sat there in comfortable silence until the food arrived. Jamal ate quickly, the warmth of the meal filling him up in a way he hadn't felt in months. As they ate, Mr. Carlson started to talk. He told Jamal about his job, something with finance, though Jamal didn't understand most of it, and about his family. He had no kids, and his parents were long gone. He talked about his brother, who lived in another state, and his dog, Max, who had passed away a few years ago. Jamal listened, nodding occasionally, but mostly he was just trying to understand why Mr. Carlson was doing all this, why he cared. After they finished eating, they walked back to the motel. Jamal felt the food settle in his stomach, the warmth making him feel sleepy. When they got back to the room, Mr. Carlson looked at him, his expression serious. "Jamal, I know this isn't easy for you," he said. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but I want to help. I want you to have a chance, a real chance, and I promise I'm not going to let you down." Jamal looked at him, his eyes wide. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that maybe this time things could be different. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Okay." Mr. Carlson smiled, his eyes softening. "Get some rest, kid. Tomorrow's a new day." Jamal climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up around him. For the first time in a long time, he let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Jamal woke up the next morning to the sound of water running in the bathroom. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the motel room. The bed beneath him was still warm, and for a moment he almost forgot where he was. Then the events of the last few days came flooding back, and he remembered Mr. Carlson, the airport, the officers. He was still here, still safe, at least for now. The door to the bathroom opened, and Mr. Carlson stepped out, rubbing a towel through his hair. He smiled when he saw Jamal sitting up. "Morning, kid. Sleep okay?" Jamal nodded, though he hadn't slept much. The bed was comfortable, but his mind had been restless, filled with images of police officers and planes. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that someone was going to come for him, that this moment of safety was just an illusion. "Good," Mr. Carlson said, tossing the towel over a chair. "Listen, we have a few things we need to do today. I need to check in with child services, let them know you're safe, and I was thinking..." He hesitated, looking at Jamal carefully. "Maybe we could get you some new clothes. You know, something a little warmer." Jamal glanced down at his jacket, the fabric worn and frayed at the edges. He bit his lip, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people offering him things, especially things he needed. "I don't have any money," Jamal mumbled, his voice barely audible. Mr. Carlson shook his head, a small smile on his face. "Don't worry about that, kid. This is on me. Consider it a thank you for saving all our lives yesterday." Jamal frowned, shifting on the bed. He wasn't used to kindness like this. He didn't know how to accept it. He nodded slowly, still unsure if he could trust this man who was going so far out of his way for him. Mr. Carlson seemed to notice Jamal's hesitation, and his expression softened. "I know this is a lot, Jamal. I know you don't have a reason to trust me yet, but I'm trying to help, all right? You deserve to have someone on your side." Jamal looked away, his throat tightening. He wanted to believe him, but the voice in the back of his head kept telling him to be careful, that nobody did something for nothing. He nodded again, just to end the conversation. "All right then," Mr. Carlson said, his voice a little brighter. "Let's get moving. We'll grab some breakfast first, then head to the store." They left the motel and walked to the same diner they'd eaten at the night before. The waitress smiled at Mr. Carlson, recognizing him, and led them to a booth by the window. Jamal slid into the seat, his eyes scanning the diner nervously. He couldn't help but feel like everyone was watching him, like they all knew he didn't belong there. Mr. Carlson ordered pancakes and eggs for both of them, and Jamal stayed quiet, his eyes focused on the table. He could feel Mr. Carlson watching him, but he didn't look up. He didn't know how to talk to him, didn't know what to say. "So, Jamal," Mr. Carlson said after a few minutes, "you said your dad was a mechanic, right? Is that how you knew something was wrong with the plane?" Jamal nodded, finally looking up. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet. "He used to fix cars. I'd watch him sometimes. He showed me stuff, like how to tell when something wasn't right." Mr. Carlson smiled, nodding. "That's pretty impressive, kid. Not many people would have noticed something like that." Jamal shrugged, not sure what to say. He didn't feel impressive. He felt scared and out of place. He wanted to believe Mr. Carlson, but the fear of disappointment was too strong. Their food arrived and Jamal ate quickly, the warmth of the pancakes and eggs filling him up. Mr. Carlson watched him, his expression thoughtful. "You know," Mr. Carlson said, his voice gentle, "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I want to make sure you're okay, Jamal. I want to help you find a place where you can feel safe." Jamal paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at Mr. Carlson, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Carlson seemed taken aback by the question. He set his coffee cup down, leaning forward slightly. "Why what?" he asked. "Why do you care?" Jamal said, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing all this for me? You don't even know me." Mr. Carlson was silent for a moment, his eyes studying Jamal. He let out a slow breath, then nodded. "That's a fair question," he said. "I guess I see a kid who's been through a lot. A kid who did something really brave and who deserves a chance. I can't explain it all, Jamal. I just know that I want to help. I want to give you a shot at something better." Jamal swallowed, his chest tightening. He looked away, his eyes stinging. He wanted to believe him, but it was hard. It was so hard to trust anyone after everything he'd been through. They finished their breakfast in silence, and then Mr. Carlson paid the bill, leading Jamal out of the diner. They walked down the street to a small clothing store, the kind with racks of second-hand clothes lined up outside. Mr. Carlson gestured for Jamal to go ahead. "Pick out whatever you need, kid," Mr. Carlson said, giving him a gentle smile. "Let's make sure you stay warm." Jamal hesitated, then nodded. He walked slowly through the racks, his fingers brushing over the fabric. He picked out a new jacket, a thick one that looked like it would keep the cold out, and then grabbed a couple of shirts and a pair of jeans. He glanced back at Mr. Carlson, who gave him an encouraging nod. They took the clothes to the counter, and Mr. Carlson paid without hesitation. Jamal watched him, still trying to figure out why this man was doing all of this. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too good to be true, that any minute now, Mr. Carlson would decide he was too much trouble and leave him behind. When they left the store, Mr. Carlson turned to Jamal, his expression serious. "I need to check in with child services now," he said. "They need to know where you are and that you're safe. I'm going to be honest with you, Jamal. This part might be tough. They're going to want to know if you have any family, and they might want to put you in a shelter." Jamal felt his stomach drop, fear clawing at his insides. He shook his head, stepping back. "No, I don't want to go to a shelter," he said, his voice trembling. Mr. Carlson held up his hands, his expression calm. "I know, kid. I know. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. But we need to play by their rules for now, all right? I promise you, I'm not going to let them take you without a fight." Jamal looked at him, his eyes wide and filled with fear. He wanted to believe him, but the thought of going back to a shelter made his skin crawl. He nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Okay," he whispered. Mr. Carlson gave him a reassuring smile. "Come on, let's get this over with." They walked to a nearby building, a drab grey office where Mr. Carlson said they had an appointment. They entered the waiting area, and Jamal's eyes darted around, taking in the rows of chairs, the posters on the walls, the small desk where a receptionist was talking on the phone. Mr. Carlson checked in, then led Jamal to a pair of chairs in the corner. They sat in silence, the air thick with tension. Jamal's hands were clenched in his lap, his fingers trembling. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to face whatever was coming. After a few minutes, a door opened and a woman stepped out, her expression warm and professional. She looked at Mr. Carlson, then at Jamal, her smile gentle. "Mr. Carlson, Jamal, you can come on back," she said. Jamal stood, his legs shaky, and followed Mr. Carlson through the door. They entered a small office, and the woman gestured for them to sit down. She took a seat behind her desk, her eyes kind as she looked at Jamal. "Hi, Jamal," she said, her voice soft. "My name is Ms. Richards. I'm with Child Services. I just want to talk to you a little bit, okay? I want to make sure you're safe, and that we can find the best way to help you." Jamal nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He looked at Mr. Carlson, who gave him a small nod. "Jamal, I know this is scary," Ms. Richards said, "but you're not in any trouble. We just want to help. Can you tell me a little about yourself? Where you've been staying? What's been going on?" Jamal hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. He took a deep breath, then slowly began to speak, his voice shaky. He told her about the airport, about his parents, about the months he'd spent on his own, hiding from the cold and from the authorities. Ms. Richards listened, her expression softening as he spoke. When he finished, she nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "Thank you for telling me, Jamal," she said. "I know that wasn't easy. I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to help you. Mr. Carlson here has offered to take care of you for now, and we think that might be the best option, if you're comfortable with it." Jamal glanced at Mr. Carlson, then back at Ms. Richards. He nodded, his chest tight with a mix of fear and hope. "Okay," he whispered. Ms. Richards smiled. "All right, we're going to take this one step at a time, okay? You're not alone, Jamal. We're here to help." Jamal nodded, his heart pounding. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Jamal walked beside Mr. Carlson, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his new jacket. It felt strange, having clothes that actually fit, clothes that weren't filled with holes and memories of cold nights. The morning had been a whirlwind. Child Services asking questions, Mr. Carlson standing by him the whole time, Ms. Richards explaining what the next steps might be. It had been overwhelming, but Jamal felt a sense of relief now that it was over, at least for today. Mr. Carlson had suggested they do something different, something to take Jamal's mind off the stress. They were heading back to the airport, but not like before. This time, they had special permission. Mr. Carlson said he'd arranged for a visit, something about thanking Jamal properly. Jamal wasn't sure what to expect, but he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. They approached a security checkpoint, and Mr. Carlson showed the guard some paperwork. The guard nodded, letting them through a side entrance. Jamal followed, feeling his heart rate pick up as they walked closer to the tarmac. The sound of engines filled the air, a steady rumble that vibrated through his chest. They reached a small group of technicians standing by one of the service vehicles. One of them looked up, a smile breaking across his face when he saw them approaching. "There he is, the hero of the day," the man called, waving them over. Jamal blinked, glancing at Mr. Carlson, who smiled and nodded. The technician stepped forward, offering Jamal a hand to shake. Jamal hesitated, then took it, feeling the man's strong grip. "My name's Ron," the technician said, his grin wide. "You must be Jamal. I heard you've got quite the eye for details." Jamal blushed, looking down at his feet. "I just saw something was wrong," he mumbled. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." Ron nodded, his expression growing serious. "And because of you, no one did. We all owe you for that, kid. You saved a lot of lives that day. Not many people would have noticed what you did, let alone had the guts to do something about it." Jamal swallowed, glancing up at Ron, then at the other technicians standing nearby. They were all watching him, nodding in agreement. He felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of pride and uncertainty. He wasn't used to this, to people looking at him like he mattered. One of the other technicians stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "Want to see what we're working on today?" she asked. "We figured, since you know your way around an engine, you might want to take a closer look." Jamal's eyes widened, and he looked up at Mr. Carlson, who nodded. "Go ahead, Jamal. It's okay," Mr. Carlson said, his voice soft. Jamal nodded, stepping closer to the technician. She handed him the clipboard, and he looked down at the diagrams and notes, his eyes scanning the paper. She pointed towards one of the planes parked nearby, a large maintenance panel open on its side. "We've been working on this hydraulic system here," she said, her voice warm. "It's a lot like the part you noticed the leak from the other day. Want to take a look?" Jamal nodded, his heart pounding with excitement. He followed her to the side of the plane, and she handed him a flashlight. Jamal peered inside, his eyes taking in the maze of pipes, valves, and metal panels. It was complicated, but somehow it made sense to him. He could see the parts, the way they connected, the way everything fit together. "See that valve there?" the technician said, pointing. "That's where the leak was coming from. You caught it before it got too bad, but it could have been a real disaster if it wasn't fixed." Jamal nodded, his eyes fixed on the valve. He felt a swell of pride in his chest. He had done this. He had stopped something terrible from happening. He looked up at the technician, who smiled. "You've got a good eye, kid," she said. "You ever think about doing this for a living? Working on planes, I mean?" Jamal blinked, taken aback. He had never thought about it. Not really. He'd been too busy just trying to survive. But now, standing here, with the smell of oil and metal filling the air, it didn't seem impossible. He looked over at Mr. Carlson, who was watching him with a proud smile. "Maybe," Jamal said, his voice quiet. I think I'd like that." The technician nodded, her smile widening. "Well, you've got the talent for it, that's for sure. Keep it up, Jamal. You've got a bright future ahead of you." Jamal felt his cheeks flush, and he nodded, his heart pounding. He had never heard words like that before. Never had anyone tell him he had a future at all, let alone a bright one. He handed the flashlight back, stepping away from the panel, his head spinning. Mr. Carlson walked over, resting a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice gentle. Jamal nodded, blinking back the tears that were threatening to form. "Yeah," he said, his voice cracking. I didn't think." Mr. Carlson gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I know," he said softly. "But you deserve this, Jamal. You deserve to have something to look forward to." Jamal swallowed hard, nodding. He looked back at the technicians, who were returning to their work, still smiling at him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their words settle in his chest. Maybe he did have a future. Maybe, just maybe, he could be more than just a kid surviving on the streets. Ron waved at Jamal again, gesturing towards the truck. "Hey, kid, want to come help us with the tools? We could use an extra pair of hands." Jamal hesitated, looking at Mr. Carlson, who nodded. "Go on," Mr. Carlson said, smiling. "I'll be right here." Jamal smiled, a real smile, and nodded, running over to Ron and the truck. He climbed into the back, his hands brushing over the metal toolbox. It felt good to do something, to feel useful. Ron gave him a list of tools to grab, and Jamal worked quickly, finding each one and handing it over, the weight of them feeling solid and real in his hands. As the afternoon wore on, Jamal found himself laughing with the technicians, listening to their stories, learning about the planes. They treated him like one of their own, like he belonged there. For the first time in a long time, Jamal didn't feel invisible. He felt like part of something, like he mattered. When the work was done, and the technicians began packing up their tools, Ron clapped Jamal on the back. "You did good today, kid," he said. "You ever want to come back and learn more, you just let us know. You've got a knack for this." Jamal nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he just smiled, his eyes shining. Ron gave him a nod, then turned back to his work. Mr. Carlson walked over, his eyes warm. "Ready to head out?" he asked. Jamal nodded, wiping at his eyes quickly before Mr. Carlson could see. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little hoarse. They walked back through the airport, the noise of the tarmac fading behind them. As they stepped into the terminal, Jamal looked up at Mr. Carlson, his heart pounding. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "for everything." Mr. Carlson looked down at him, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Jamal," he said. "I'm just glad I could be here for you." Jamal nodded, his throat tight. He had always been alone, always had to look out for himself, because no one else would. But maybe now things were different. Maybe now he wasn't alone. They made their way out of the airport and back to the car. As they drove away, Jamal watched the planes in the distance, their wings catching the light of the setting sun. He let out a slow breath, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't perfect. There were still a lot of things to figure out, still a lot of uncertainty. But for now, he was okay. For now, he had someone who cared, someone who was willing to fight for him. And that was enough. The next few days were different. They were not like any days Jamal had experienced in a long time. He woke up every morning on a bed, an actual bed, with a warm blanket over him. He would wake to the sound of Mr. Carlson making coffee, the smell wafting through the small room of the motel, and there would be breakfast waiting on the table. This morning was no different. Jamal rubbed his eyes, blinking as the light filtered in through the window. He sat up, looking around the room. Mr. Carlson was sitting at the small table, sipping his coffee and reading something on his phone. When he noticed Jamal was awake, he gave him a smile. "Morning, kid. How'd you sleep?" Mr. Carlson asked. Jamal shrugged, mumbling, "Fine." He still wasn't used to it, the comfort, the warmth. It felt fragile, like it could be taken away at any moment. "Well, I've got good news," Mr. Carlson said, setting his coffee cup down. "I talked to Ms. Richards yesterday. She said that for now, you're going to stay with me, as long as you're okay with that." Jamal blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "Stay with you?" he repeated. Mr. Carlson nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, at least until we figure something more permanent out. I want you to feel comfortable, Jamal. I want you to have a chance to see what it's like to be a kid again." Jamal didn't know what to say. He stared at the floor, his fingers picking at the blanket on his lap. He felt a strange mix of emotions, hope, fear, disbelief. He had wanted a place to belong for so long, but he didn't know if he could trust this, if he could let himself believe that it was real. Is that really okay?" Jamal asked, his voice small. Mr. Carlson smiled, nodding. It's more than okay, Jamal. I want you to be here. We'll take things one day at a time, all right? Jamal swallowed hard, nodding. Okay, he whispered. Mr. Carlson stood up, clapping his hands together. Great. So I've got a surprise for you today. We're moving out of this motel. I found a place we can stay. It's a rental, but it's got more space. I think you'll like it. Jamal's eyes widened. A real place, not just a motel room. He nodded, feeling excitement bubble up inside him. He didn't dare let it show too much. He still wasn't sure if this would last, but it was hard to keep the smile from his face. Come on, kid, Mr. Carlson said, giving him a grin. Let's get ready and head over there. I want you to see it. They packed up their things, Jamal's few belongings fitting easily into his old backpack, along with the new clothes Mr. Carlson had gotten him. They loaded everything into Mr. Carlson's car, and Jamal climbed into the passenger seat, his heart pounding with anticipation. As they drove through the city, Jamal watched the buildings pass by, his eyes wide. He tried not to think about the last time he had been in a car like this, when everything had fallen apart. He focused instead on Mr. Carlson, who was humming along to the radio, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel. Finally, they pulled up in front of a small house, a single-story rental with a yard that was overgrown but charming. Mr. Carlson parked the car and looked at Jamal, smiling. Here we are, he said, his voice warm. It's not much, but I think it'll be homey once we settle in. Jamal got out of the car, his eyes wide as he looked at the house. It was painted blue, the color faded from the sun, and the front steps creaked a bit as he walked up. But it was a house, a real place. He felt his chest tighten with emotion. Mr. Carlson unlocked the door, pushing it open. After you, he said, stepping aside to let Jamal enter. Jamal walked inside, his eyes scanning the small living room. There was an old couch, a rug that looked a little worn, and a kitchen area that opened off to the side. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and it felt safe. What do you think? Mr. Carlson asked, watching Jamal carefully. Jamal nodded, his voice catching in his throat. It's nice, he said quietly. Mr. Carlson smiled, patting Jamal on the back. I'm glad you think so, kid. This is your home now, for as long as you need it to be. Jamal looked around, his heart pounding. A home. He had thought he would never have one again. He nodded, swallowing hard. He still didn't know if he could trust it, but he wanted to. More than anything, he wanted to. They spent the rest of the morning unpacking. Mr. Carlson showed Jamal his room. It was small, with a twin bed and a dresser, but to Jamal, it felt like a palace. He put his things away carefully, folding his clothes and tucking his blanket into the corner of the bed. After they were done, Mr. Carlson clapped his hands together. All right, kid. How about we do something fun today? I was thinking we could head down to the rec center. I hear they've got some activities for kids your age. Jamal hesitated, his eyes widening. The rec center? He asked. He hadn't been around other kids in so long. The idea made his stomach twist with anxiety. Mr. Carlson nodded, his expression understanding. I know it's a lot, Jamal, but I think it'll be good for you. You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Just give it a try, all right? Jamal swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. He didn't know if he could handle being around other kids again, but he didn't want to disappoint Mr. Carlson. Okay, he said. They drove to the rec center, and Jamal felt his hands clench in his lap, nerves buzzing under his skin. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if the other kids would be nice, or if they would see right through him, see that he didn't belong. When they got there, Mr. Carlson walked in with him, his hand resting gently on Jamal's shoulder. They approached the front desk, where a woman with a bright smile greeted them. Hi there. What can I do for you today? She asked. Mr. Carlson smiled back, his voice warm. This is Jamal.